it's amazing what the littlest things can do, like in life. Like when you surround yourself with people who are just negative, not happy with life, which I get it, I've been there, I've done that, but I'm choosing, even on my worst days, to not let the negativity bring me down, because at the end of the day, I mean, when I was negative and I lived and breathed negativity, it showed on my family, it showed on my children, it showed on myself. It shows, like, it really truly shows. So you have to, what I do now is, and again, don't get me wrong, I have my bad days, I have my off days, we all do, we're human, right? But on those days, I choose to do something that will bring me up, whether it's reading a book, or reading a quote, or reading something, finding something positive to read.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to move to an area that I think is the undiscovered country of both true crime and the Chris Watts case. It is non-dualism. For a long time, I've felt that we've gotten stuck in the minutiae of the Chris Watts case, in the details, this side arguing about that, and we're missing the broader picture. What lessons do we ultimately learn from the Chris Watts case? It's one of the tragedies, one of the travesties of the fact that this case didn't go to trial. I think it could have been a healing experience actually for America, in terms of wellness, in terms of what is going on in the suburbs, in terms of what is going on between husbands and wives, in terms of our concepts of what is a true or valid or authentic happily ever after. I do think the Chris Watts case is a simple analogy. So let me put it a different way. The thinking in the Chris Watts case, I'm talking about of the individuals that are in that story, is an analogy for the thinking in the wider world. And we first got to identify what that thinking is in order to transcend it, in order to learn from it. And one of the ways that we do that is through this whole conversation about non-dualism. There are a lot of other conversations we could have. One of them is about multi-level marketing. Another one is about labeling people. You know, are you this or that disorder? Are you that or that kind of person? If you label someone else, you likely label yourself. We can talk about the impact of the mega machine on human psychology, transactionality, and so on. But we're going to limit ourselves in this episode to non-dualism. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to the 100 or so who've subscribed since the last video, and let's get started. So first of all, I need to credit someone on Patreon who brought this up. It's something that I've also brought up in my books. It's this idea of a dual universe. And I'm waiting for the patron to give me permission to quote at length from his comment. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more in general terms about the concept. So if you think about dualism, so we want to get to non-dualism. If you think about dualism, well, basically it is just dealing with polarities, opposites, things that are hot or cold, truth, lies, health, sickness, introvert, extrovert, love, hate, rich, poor, life, death. And if you take these polarities, these dualities, and you apply them, they find resonance all over the Chris Watts case. There's the love for a mistress, the hate for the bind that he finds in his marriage, the dislike, I don't know if hate is the right word, maybe it is, for in-laws from the one side of the couple equation. There's the wellness of thrive juxtaposed with sickness, allergies, hospital visits. there is the heat of a living body. And do you remember when Coda said, well, we need to get your children out of the cold, right? There's the appearance of being rich, the big house, the luxury car, the Thrive lifestyle, and then the reality of poverty and debt and desperation and downsizing, right? There's just, I think the primary duality in this case is life and death. There's the life of the family, the vitality. You see the photos of the Watts family, and that they look like the sparkling, happy family. And then underneath that is something else. You have the unborn life, the burgeoning child growing in Shanann's womb. And then you have this ignominious end, the pregnant woman buried in a shallow grave, covered in dust, buried face first. The children, the white light of life snuffed out as they are drowned, their bodies drowned in black oil, right? So you have so many of these dualities, and I think it manifests in a way that we perhaps haven't quite fully grasped, where Chris Watts takes the plea deal, goes to jail, goes to prison, and then discovers God, and then he blames the devil for everything that has happened. And I think that although some people scoff at that, and although some people may look at that with understanding and say, oh, now it all makes sense, what that ultimately, I think, shows us is not Chris Watts' psychology, but actually our own. The way we look at things through two dimensions. It's either good or it's bad. It's either light or it's dark. And this is something that comes to us through a long, long period of people thinking about the world in a particular way. Now, I must say, when I talk about true crime rocket science, this is the kind of stuff that I want to be talking about to you guys. This is the kind of stuff I want us to be thinking about. I don't want to be caught in the quagmire of crimes and dark motives and so on. I think there's a place for that. But you need to graduate from there at some point. You need to say, okay, we know what happened. Now let's move into, what do we learn from this? What practical value can we take out of this? And that is part of the hero's journey. The hero goes on an adventure, or a trial or a quest, and discovers all sorts of things, and then he comes back into the world and shares the lesson that he's learned. He may come back with a trinket or a treasure or an insight or something like that, but it's important to come back from that journey, right? I'd hate to describe the tragedy of the Watts case as an adventure. I think it is it's kind of a holocaust, right? But we need to come back out of it and look out into the light, come out of the cold and look into the sunrise and see spring and see a new hope, right? All that kind of thing. But in order to do that, I think we've got to understand where the roots of human psychology, and we've also got to understand the psychology of this case, and then also how our psychology needs to change. In other words, how it needs to go from dualism to non-dualism. What I really like about this comment that a patron left a couple of hours ago is that he talks about that he's trying to make it more applicable in his life without changing his life completely. That whole idea where there's some kind of magic pill or a magic bullet or a quick fix in some way and you're going to change your life completely, that is also dualism, where you say, oh, I don't like my life, I'm going to click my finger, snap a switch, flick a switch, and suddenly it's going to be completely different. Part of the past is always going to be with you into the future. Part of who you are, what you are, is always going to be with you into the future. In the same way with Chris Watts, he may be trying to escape the consequences of his past, and maybe to some extent he can, but not really. He is what he is. It is what it is. But to some extent, you can transcend that. And it all comes down to your psychology. Obviously, it's easier to transcend that kind of thing if you're not in prison, if you're not in a cage. Okay, so I'm going to quote from Ernest Becker, a Pulitzer Prize winning anthropologist. And it's from his book, The Life and Death of Meaning. I think it's quite appropriately titled. It's page 119, and he talks about the invisible world. You might as well be talking about dualism. So I'm quoting from Ernest Becker's book, the bottom of page 119, and this is what he says about dualism. He says, quote, "Probably for 500,000 years, mankind has believed that there were two worlds, a visible one in which everyday action took place, and a greater, much more powerful world, the invisible one, upon which the visible one depended and from which it drew its powers." Right? But in a more general sense, we think of the two worlds as something that we see around us. There's night and dark. There's night and day. There's good and evil. There is, sunshine and rain. There's summer and winter, right? And it's through the world around us that we can start to see, well, isn't there something between these polarities, right? And think about it. Think about the North Pole or the South Pole, the Arctic and the Antarctic, and the equator. Isn't there something that exists between those polar opposites, right? You could also just say between the North and the South Pole. Isn't there something that exists between that? And you could actually argue that there's more between the polarities than the polarities themselves. So if we're fixated with good and evil, you've got to say, cheapers, there's so much going on between those opposites, right? And we inclined, and this is where you need to start bending your mind, bending your thoughts, stretching your own psychology. When you think about Chris Watts and you think of him as evil, you are thinking about a polar opposite. So although we want to think of him that way, we want to think of him as bad, we want to think of the personage as evil, that is the polar end of his spectrum. It's also the polar end of the spectrum of society, in a way, that some permutations of society are going to commit terrible crimes while others are going to be in the happy medium, like in the middle. But the point I'm trying to get at is, even with Chris Watts, what he didn't commit murder every day of his life. He didn't think about murder every day of his life. He eventually did it, right? And so, but we are inclined to put our own cognitive bias, our own psychology, we tend to project it into the Chris Watts case and say, okay, he is evil, right? And in a way, that's how we separate, how we push him aside and say, he's evil, we are good. And that has led to this incredible battle going on for over 2 years, with people saying, well, actually Shanann wasn't such a good person either, and then the counter narrative coming out saying, well, that is victim blaming. And it's this constant duality, this constant struggle, my duality against yours. And what we're trying to argue here is for almost like a third tier, so that instead of sunshine and darkness, well, isn't there another thing that exists called twilight? Instead of the past and the future, isn't there somewhere else called the present, right? And part of how you get to non-dualism is letting go of time. And as soon as you let go of time, you start letting go of your own connections to it. In other words, your memories of time, how time has shaped you, and you start to let go of your own ego. Your ego is bound by time. So going back to Ernest Becker, around about halfway through page 120, it refers to primitive masks that give us this same feeling, and they represent something that's coldly foreign to most of us. The mask imitated personages in the spirit world, and as the ritualist put them on, he became a personage of the invisible world and began to speak with its voices and enjoy its powers. He goes on to say, in the West, the belief in a dual universe lasted right up until the Enlightenment and the 19th century, and then gradually faded away for the most part. Today we imagine that all real experience, all valid data exists on the level of the visible world alone, and we might expect we feel a real superiority in this belief over the ancients. And he goes on to talk about in a marriage scenario, one day you are simply a married couple, just two of you, and 2 years later there are two new faces with you at the table. He says we enter rooms, houses, theaters, stadiums full of faces that were invisible 80 years ago, and yet most of us claim we know where they came from. And it's really interesting. I'd really like to go into this in more detail, but he's basically building up to this whole thing of dualism of worlds, the dimensions that we see our lives in, right? And how our society in the end is constructed. It's based on this whole idea of dualism. And because we've lost to some extent our spirituality of the past, where we were connected to the spiritual world of nature, our dualism has become even more superficial. And if you think about a computer, for example, a computer basically operates on a dual platform. It's either a 1 or a 0. It's either this or that, right? And although there are algorithms that are functioning that I think can intuit subtlety in our behavior, basically we either respond to something or we don't. We're either stimulated by something or we're not. We either like something and subscribe or we don't. We either retweet or we don't. And there's no button for something that's in between where we are moved but we don't necessarily act based on that feeling. And that is actually who we are. Those polarities are what computers are recording. They're recording the things that touch us and trigger us, but they don't measure the rest of our humanity. Do you see what I'm talking about? One of the things I've noticed with the Chris Watts case that I find fascinating is this idea that everyone's reality is different. I find it fascinating, but also find it terrifying. I find it fascinating in the Chris Watts case because it's reality as a concept, and we've all seen how reality shifted with the shadows coming alive on the driveway, and now anything is possible, and you can conjure whatever reality you want, in theory. And in the Chris Watts case, it's almost a safe place to entertain those ideas and to stretch reality whichever way you want to. But when you take it into the real world beyond the Chris Watts case, it can be quite terrifying, where you have a political scenario where you have an election and you can then decide whatever outcome suits you or whatever outcome you believe, and that is your reality. Now, your reality is absolutely fine until it confronts somebody else's reality. And that is also where and why we need to learn that there's something beyond dualism. And what I mean by that is, so I have my reality, you have your reality, and now we are at cross purposes. So what happens when you, in that situation, you might be of a certain, you might be a man, someone else might be a woman, and so can you never agree on anything? You might be from a different nationality, and you've been taught that your nationalities are not compatible. Well, now what do you do with that? You in the same elevator as that person, you in the same classroom with that person, you in the same church or suburb as that person, what are you going to do with that situation? You're in a duality. What are you going to do with that? And so non-dualism talks to this whole idea of reality as a concept. And this is quoting from this comment that I got on Patreon today. We create words, thus we haven't invented descriptions for everything. So that is again where we come to a label. You have words that label someone and now you know who they are. You don't have a description for them. You can't think about them beyond the label. In the same way that, you know, a computer algorithm might have a good profile for you. It might say your name, your age, your geographic location. It might be able to pinpoint your GPS movements, but can it account for your dreams, your memories, your childhood, your the wounded child in you, your potential, right? And so this comment on Patreon talks about a tree isn't realized as a tree on its own because we have named it a tree. I think this is such an interesting concept. You know, it's the same thing as if you say Chris Watts is a covert narcissist. He suddenly doesn't become a covert narcissist and now we know what he is and he also knows what he is. He's something beyond that. And the same applies to us. We are beyond the labels that we give others and that we give ourselves. I think one of the reasons people get depressed is they take on this whole idea of labels and then eventually they take on a label themselves and they find that the label is absolute, that the label is incontrovertible, that the label cannot be escaped or transcended. And so just to go into this in a bit further detail, again I'm quoting from his comment, is he talks about to start to transcend this duality. He talks about he's been researching it for months. You've got to let go of your person. So the past doesn't exist. You've got to let go of your past. This is how we learn lessons from the Watts case. But in terms of we are not criminals. We also need to forgive ourselves for what we did in the past, not crimes, but perhaps things that we wish didn't happen. And how we do that is you let go of the past. The past no longer exists. You can just have it almost floating, hovering away, turning into a fog. It's no longer something that is shackling you, right? That thoughts are pointless, that anything that involves thinking as the characters you've invented is out the window. This is from this comment that I received today. There's more to say about it, and I might do a second episode on what happens as soon as you go into this process where you suspend some of these long-held dual beliefs. So I'll take you a little bit through that process, and maybe we can even get this chap to, talk to us about his experience. But let's go into non-dualism in a general way. What are we talking about when we're talking about non-dualism? So the Wikipedia definition is not two, or one divided without a second. So it's something that's divided, but it's not just two versions of it. It also refers to a mature state of consciousness in which the dichotomy of the other is transcended. So it's not always about me versus you, me at the expense of you, us versus them. Do you know what I'm saying? And you can almost think about it as siblings in a family. It's always about what is happening to the other one. My life is always relative to yours. My happiness is always relative to yours. My situation is always relative to yours. How do you get out of that bind? And that's exactly what it is. I think Chris Watts felt that he was in a bind with Shanann. He couldn't see a way out of his marriage without destroying his family, right? That is the extent to which he was caught up in this bind. And if he was able to look beyond dualities, to say, well, there is life after marriage, not only for me, but for my children as well, for my wife as well. There's also life after death, right? Anyway, he goes on to, if we go on through this, it talks about having a centerless awareness. So you're not centered on necessarily a particular belief system. It's not always relative to something else. And it is a state of consciousness, according to the Wikipedia definition, that seems to be spontaneous. It is something that is organic. It is something that is happening in the real world, in the moment of creation. And it follows prolonged preparation. So you don't just snap your fingers and now you are centerless. It takes a long time to break those ego connections to things, to people, to names, to places, to time periods. Now, I'm sure the Christians amongst you would say, wow, this feels very new age. I don't like it. It seems very Buddhist, for lack of a better word, or whatever. But if you apply this to the Chris Watts case and you say, had Chris Watts been able to break his ego connection to, for example, the debt situation, if he'd said, okay, this debt doesn't define me. I'm not caught up in this debt. This debt isn't who I am, right? These bills that are in my name or whatever isn't the be-all, end-all. Then it wouldn't have been necessary in his psychology to take the drastic action that he took. He could have said, there's a gray area, there's a different level. We can go from downsizing our home, we can put the children into a different school, or we can, develop a kind of a daycare amongst friends, perhaps amongst thrivers or whatever. But the point is, he was so caught up by the duality that he was in that he found that he couldn't escape it. If you go through the Wikipedia definitions, there are quite a few. There are a lot of people with different definitions. One that I like is the idea that the multiplicity of the universe is reduced to one essential reality. So it is at the same time saying there's one reality, but there's many parts of that reality. And I think that in a way is a good summary of the Chris Watts case as well, to say there is basically what happened, but then you see many interpretations from many different people, authors and so on. One of the ways that you can feel the duality in ourselves, in the people that are paying attention to the Chris Watts case, is that the way that they take pot shots at one another, at the way they don't like to be counted, or they don't like someone disagreeing with them because their reality, their way of seeing things is kind of absolute kind of thing. And what we need is a situation where we can tolerate something that disagrees with us, right? I'm all for that, as long as what we are tolerating isn't flying in the face of reality. So it's fine to have a different interpretation of something if it's honest and if it's authentic and if it is backed up by evidence. But if it's something that is opportunistic, if it's something that is designed to get views in a mercenary way, in a mischievous way, then I'm a little bit less tolerant, and I think you have to be. I don't think in law and order, in justice, I think you've got to be careful with this whole concept of non-dualism, because at the end of the day you've got to decide in terms of the law, are you guilty or are you innocent? And obviously the law does make provision for different levels of guilt and different levels of culpability, right? But I think law enforcement, at the same time that law enforcement's got to be careful with non-dualism, I think it's also got to be careful with dualism. I just read a report today on CNN about a young boy who was, I think, mentally disturbed, or a young man who was mentally disturbed, and I think he was hugging his mother, and someone I think his sister called the police because she was afraid that he would harm his mother, and the police came there, violently pulled him off his mother, put a knee on his neck, and he died shortly after that. And what is happening there is that they fail to understand the situation. They fail to bear in mind that this was her son, that she loved him, that he loved her, that there was something going on beyond a physical assault or something that the police may have interpreted as good or bad. Do you see what I'm saying? This wasn't a stranger attacking the mother. It was actually the mother holding her son so that he wouldn't, I'm not sure, that he wouldn't take some kind of drastic action. And the police misinterpreted this because they were seeing things through the filter of good, evil, right, wrong, whatever. And there's another level to that. And one of the fastest ways, as far as I'm concerned, that you escape the dual thinking is by not using labels. Also, another way of not using labels is to come away from referring to a person, especially in true crime, as NK or CW or SW or whatever. Whether it's this crime or another crime, if it's John Benet Ramsey referring to JBR, JR, PR, BR, IDI, all that kind of stuff. It's easy to get caught up in the complexities of non-dualism. All I want you to think about just going forward, try to think about it for a day, maybe 2 days or whatever, but try and think about things without time. So as you go through today, try to think about things without them being related to time, and you'll see how difficult it is. Try to think about things without putting labels on them, and you'll see how difficult it is. It is something that is part and parcel of our society. It is part of the mainstream media. It is part of social media, this whole thing of labeling ourselves, turning ourselves into avatars, reducing ourselves over and over again to either a 1 or a 0. Our economic system does the same. We have a transactional mindset. I benefit at your expense. It's something that we see in our politics, in our society, in our in work situations. This job at the expense of that job or whatever. And to some extent, belief systems are based on transactionality as well. And again, the reasons why we want to get to this place of non-dualism is so that we can transcend the bind that we find ourselves in. So we might be bound in the sense where we say, well, we live in this world and there are things happening to it, but we're paralyzed to do something about that. And it might be something like the coronavirus, where you say, well, I just don't believe it. Or climate change, I just don't believe it. And how do you transcend that kind of thing? How do you transcend a situation like that? How do you transcend a situation where other people just don't believe a certain reality? And I think the answer is you need to start moving away from labels, and you need to start moving away from time, and you need to start being in the moment. And the more not only you can do that, but the more other people can do that, the more the world will start to shift and become fluid again, rather than this fixed thing that isn't actually real. I'm just going to end off with just something out of my little universe to share with you. I've just had a bird fly into my window, but it's a little bit to do with that. As I was preparing for today, I was sitting outside on my patio, and for a very long time I've been wanting to catch a glimpse of the swallow leaving its nest. I've often sat below the nest and just stared up at the nest, waiting for it to appear while my eyes are on the nest. And today is a particularly beautiful day. It's always like this when there's been a big shower of rain. Anyway, long story short, it's a beautiful day, and I think because the swallow has babies, little chicks, and it's been raining for, I think, a full day and a half, it needed to come back to the nest to feed the chicks, kind of thing. And so I did actually get to see the swallow come in. But in order to see something like that, which happens in the blink of an eye, you've kind of got to forget yourself. You've got to take a moment out of your own thoughts, your own world, and be open to something like that. And I didn't have to wait very long, and I did notice the swallow sort of flicking around the garden, making a few sort of circuits to decide whether to dart into the nest or not. But I'm just saying, to see something that is out of the ordinary, you need to put yourself aside. Otherwise, you're just seeing what you want to see. Another, I think, example of how to get out of the bind of being yourself and stuck with you and stuck with your labels is, for example, when you get a dog. It could just be something else, like living in another country or being in a different situation, going on a holiday. But for example, when you have a dog, you suddenly see the world through a doggy universe. The world is quite simple and quite fun. There's tremendous excitement in something like going for a walk. There's fun to be had in eating, in a ball, in sitting on someone's lap, kind of thing, right? And it just takes you out of, again, your dualistic world where you see something in a certain way and you start to see something in a different way. And I want to encourage you guys who've come a long way with the Watts case to start to learn from the Chris Watts case in a way that you learn lessons from the Chris Watts case that help you in your life, that helps your life be a better life. And ultimately helps us make a better world. If you are a better person for this quest that we've taken through the Chris Watts case, if you come back a better person, more aware of what can happen to people and families, then you are part of making a better society. Thomas Hardy once said, "If a path to the better there be, it begins with a full look at the worst," right? And so we've done that. We've looked at the worst. We've looked at the Watts case. And we've looked at it fully, I hope. I think many of us can say that, but until we've looked at it fully and properly, then we haven't looked at it at all. In other words, until we've seen the reality of the Chris Watts case, which is a full look, and we've seen it for what it is, then the path to the better folds out in front of us. And that is what I've tried to do with what I think is the authentic narrative of the Chris Watts case. When you know that authentic story, then your authentic path rolls out in front of you. And it is important to eventually complete your look at the worst, and then head out onto that path to the better you, the better world. If you'd like to continue this conversation on non-dualism, let me know. As I say, I'll try and get this chap on Patreon to talk a little bit more about it. For those interested in the John Benet Ramsey case, I'll be starting off a new series on the Khan's order, which is a counter to the Ramsey did it theory, and that is something I'm going to be doing on YouTube. On Patreon, I'm doing an analysis of a Dateline documentary that's really pretty incredible, about 12 episodes on that. And then Thursdays and Fridays I also cover The Ripper on Patreon. So head on to patreon.com/TCRS. I'm also narrating the Craven Silence audiobook on Patreon. Right now I'm on chapter 7. So that's also something you can hear, is some of the books that I've written narrated by me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.